It was a sophisticated restaurant, exactly the kind of place where she would never have thought anyone would confront her. The soft music, the clink of glasses, the yellowish glow of the lights. Everything seemed perfect, except to me. And there I was, standing with the cold ring in my palm, the still polished metal reflecting a shadow of what we once were, of what I thought we still were. It had been more than a marriage, it was my whole life built around that woman, the trust and respect that I thought were indestructible. But nothing remained of that. Nothing but the sound of my own heart, beating louder than any background music. Her lover was sitting in front of her, casual and comfortable, as if he belonged there. Maybe he did, after all. They looked at each other, exchanging subtle, complicit smiles. It was an expression I had never seen on her face while she was with me, a face of guiltless pleasure, open freedom. Her hand lightly touched his, a simple gesture, but one that burned my chest with a sharp pain. I wondered if she was capable of feeling at least a fraction of that, a tiny part of the guilt or remorse that I believed any honest human being would have. But nothing. Just her quiet gaze at him, the slight tilt of her head, her muffled laughter, her hands folded on the table, leaving me in the shadow of what I didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to see. I took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in my hands. The ring seemed to weigh tons now. It was a small piece of gold, the symbol of an eternal promise that was gradually proving to be a sham. Finally, I approached the table, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the restaurant's soft carpet, but enough for her to look up in surprise. Her lover, for his part, just frowned, his confusion momentary until he realized who I was. A yellow smile appeared on his face, as if he was about to witness something funny, having no idea who I was and what was about to happen. Without a word, I threw the ring on the table, the sound of the metal resounding like a gunshot, silent but sharp. Her face fell into an expression of guilt and panic, a mask that crumbled in seconds. "I know everything," she said, her voice firm, controlled, but charged with a fury that had been contained for months. She tried to speak, but nothing came out, just a gasping, jagged breath, while her eyes moved between me and her lover, who, still incredulous, mumbled a pathetic "I can explain," not even knowing the size of the wave that would engulf him. The truth is that I had suspected. Fragments of conversations cut off, furtive glances, increasingly frequent exits. An arsenal of signs that, at first, I ignored, convinced that she was incapable of it. However, over the last few months, the anguish had become unbearable. I followed her gaze every time she left the house with a vague excuse, or when, on the other side of the bed, she became more of a stranger than my wife. Until, one night, I decided to follow her, a mixture of curiosity and desperation eating away at every shred of sanity I still had. And it was in that act that I saw her as I never thought I would, giving herself to another man without reservation, without remorse, as if our marriage was just an insignificant detail in her story. Seeing them together, certainty filled me. And now, there, in the restaurant, every second felt like an eternity. I looked at her lover, the man who was now writhing in embarrassment and fear. Little did he know what I had discovered about him, the truth that would soon topple him from any illusion of security he thought he had. It was something she didn't know either, something that would make them both pay, in ways they could never have predicted. "Do you think you know who you're messing with?" she said, staring at her lover, who looked away without replying. "If only you'd been honest. If only you knew what kind of man you really are." And I let the insinuation hang in the air, like a slow-moving poison, increasing the tension. He swallowed dryly, and she, pale, was mute, a mirror of despair and terror. The wedding ring was still on the table between the three of us, now a distorted reminder of everything we had built. She tried to reach for my hand, perhaps to beg for mercy, perhaps to attempt one last desperate gesture of redemption. But I pushed her away with a firm, cold gaze. Every touch of hers was now just a dead weight, a cruel reminder of everything she had destroyed. "You ruined everything, and I'm going to make you remember that for the rest of your life," I whispered. Their expressions were a mixture of confusion and panic, and that's what I wanted. I wanted them to feel the betrayal, the bitter taste of shame, the fear of losing everything they believed they had taken for granted. Because I wasn't just the betrayed husband, I was the one who knew the secrets, the one who knew what no one else knew. And what did I know? What could I do with that information? Maybe I didn't need to destroy anything now. Maybe just knowing what they didn't know was enough to eat away at them, day after day, until guilt and uncertainty took over every moment of their lives. Or maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe, instead of just hinting, I should bring it out into the open, show them everything they tried to hide from me and the world. The question still hammered at me as I stared at them, both static and voiceless, plunged into a heavy, regret-filled silence. Because, for them, that romantic dinner, those laughs and complicit glances, were now nothing more than a prelude to a nightmare from which they could no longer escape. And standing there, in front of the woman I had once sworn to love, the man who had taken her away from me, I knew that what I decided to do at that moment would define the fate of each of us. Welcome to our channel. Here, there is no room to support any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful truth: betrayal is a destructive force that ruins lives and erodes bonds. Get ready for an intense and surprising narrative, where every detail reveals how lies can have devastating consequences. Enjoy the story and prepare to be shocked. It was a clear, serene morning in New York, with the sun illuminating the city and the first autumn leaves painting the sidewalks gold and orange. Michael was crossing the busy park on his way to the office, observing the hurried people who crossed his path. He had always been a focused man, one of those who kept a steady pace in life, balance between professional ambition and caring for his family. This was one of the aspects his father was most proud of, as he had also been a man dedicated to work and home. He knew exactly what he wanted from a young age and built his career in finance with the precision of someone who carefully plans every step. Now in his 40s, he held a senior position in a large investment company, but always prided himself on never letting work swallow up his personal life. At the end of the day, Michael liked to go home without being distracted, eager to see the face of his wife, Catherine. They had met in college, during a literature class they both took purely for pleasure, an escape from the academic responsibilities that absorbed them. Catherine was a woman with an easy smile and a magnetic personality, someone who lit up any room with her presence. She had always been her opposite in this respect, spontaneous, full of life, someone who embraced opportunities without thinking too much about the consequences. During their years of marriage, Catherine became the center of his life, and that was something Michael nurtured with care. He valued that love, which he thought was true and solid, built on a foundation of trust and respect. Catherine, now in her 30s, had chosen to pursue a career in the arts, a decision that, although uncertain in financial terms, brought her a fulfillment that he deeply respected. Her paintings and sculptures occupied the small studio that Michael had built at home, a space of her own, where she would lose herself for hours and often emerge, paint smeared and eyes shining, to tell him about the progress of a new piece. When they talked about the future, Catherine was always optimistic, imagining trips to exotic destinations, time for both of them to explore the world together, without the limits imposed by schedules or professional commitments. She dreamed of a life where they could devote more time to each other, exploring different places and cultures, absorbing every experience as a couple who, even after so many years, were still in love. Michael, however, was more concerned with guaranteeing stability that would sustain that risk-free lifestyle. He wanted Catherine to have every opportunity to continue living her dreams, without financial worries. That was the kind of love he believed it offered, something solid, a promise of stability that would protect her from life's ups and downs. Their routine reflected this balance, with Catherine dedicating herself to her creations in the studio and Michael investing his time in meetings and strategies that kept their financial life comfortable and secure. And as much as he strove to guarantee this security, he felt that she always yearned for something more, a freedom that he perhaps didn't fully understand, but tried to support. At weekends, the couple had a tradition. They would go out to dinner at a different restaurant, exploring new flavors and atmospheres, a custom that preserved an air of novelty and curiosity in their relationship. Catherine, always in love with new experiences, chose exotic places where international dishes were served in carefully decorated settings. On those evenings, the glances exchanged between them always carried the feeling of a deep connection, a promise that, despite their differences, they were there for each other. Last Friday, they had dined in a newly opened French bistro, with low lighting and music playing in the background. Catherine had been particularly animated, talking about a new series of sculptures she was planning and an exhibition she intended to organize. Michael listened to her, fascinated by her passion, admiring her as he always did, remembering why he had fallen so in love with her. She had a natural charm, an energy that seemed to invigorate him every time they were together. Watching her that night, he felt a familiar warmth and a sense of comfort. That same evening, after dinner, Michael noticed a different moment between them. Amid the laughter and stories, Catherine looked at him in a way he hadn't seen for a long time, with an intensity that mixed tenderness and longing, as if she wanted to prolong every second by his side. He then took her hand in his, caressed it, and murmured something about how much he loved her, about how she was everything to him. She just smiled, but a sparkle passed through her eyes before she looked away, leaving a lightness in the air that Michael interpreted as a reflection of happiness. The next day was like any other. Michael woke up early to go running, as usual, and Catherine slept soundly, her face serene against the pillow. He paused for a moment, gazing at her as she slept, feeling grateful to have her by his side, to be able to share those simple moments of a life together. This was the routine he cherished, the symbol of a home they had built together and which he had never imagined would one day fall apart. That same afternoon, Michael decided to surprise her. He went to a flower shop and chose a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite flowers, and a small box of chocolates. He knew she appreciated these small gestures and loved the way her eyes lit up when she received unexpected gifts. But when he got home, Catherine wasn't in the study or in the kitchen, where she usually spent her time. Silence enveloped him, and a faint feeling of emptiness echoed in his mind, although he quickly pushed it away, convinced that it was just a moment of stillness. When Catherine returned that evening, he noticed something different about her, a distant expression, but at the same time, she seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She thanked him for the bouquet with a smile, kissed him on the cheek, and commented on how careful he was with the details, something that made her feel special. Michael noticed the softness in her voice and realized there was something unclear. However, he preferred to ignore any suspicions, pushing away the uncomfortable feeling that was beginning to grow. Over the next few weeks, he noticed subtle changes in Catherine, small deviations in her routine that he couldn't explain. Some nights, she came home looking distant, others with an almost youthful cheerfulness. When he asked her about her day, she answered naturally, talking about her work in the studio, her meetings with gallerists, or simply the hours spent in cafes where she said she sought inspiration. But there was something about her answers that seemed vague to him, as if the words carried a superficial truth, an explanation that didn't fill the void of her absences. Still, Michael preferred to trust, attributing the strange feeling to possible stress at work or even his own imagination. He didn't want to doubt, he didn't want to see a problem where perhaps there was nothing. The balance of their routine, however, began to show cracks. Some nights, she would fall asleep before him, unusually tired, and he would sit beside her, staring at the dark ceiling and trying to understand why he felt that emptiness growing. He was a man of logic, someone who always solved problems with reason, but in this situation, the answers seemed to elude him with every new attempt to understand. Catherine, on the other hand, continued with her usual cheerfulness, at least on the surface, showing herself to be present and affectionate at many moments, enough for him to believe that everything was fine. She would launch into animated conversations about the upcoming exhibition, about how she was looking forward to seeing her pieces displayed in a respectable gallery, and he, as always, would support her, proud of the woman she was, the artist she had become. There was something almost palpable in the pride he felt for her, a feeling that made him put aside any doubts, convinced that it was all just a phase. But still, the disquiet persisted, a shadow in his mind that he couldn't quite shake off. Little by little, Michael found himself observing small details that hadn't caught his attention before: a message read in haste, a smile she tried to hide, a different scent that lingered in the air when she passed him in the corridor. Something was out of place, but he didn't know how or why it bothered him so much. The lonely nights he spent awake in silence next to her became more and more frequent, like a constant reminder that something was changing between them. He wanted to ask, he wanted to confront her, but at the same time, he was afraid of what he might discover. After all, why would she hide something from him? Why would the woman he loved with all his might seem like an enigma he couldn't decipher? The days went by, and the certainty that something was wrong grew. Michael felt that a storm was approaching, silent but inevitable. And without knowing for sure what was to come, he waited, caught between the desire to clear up his doubts and the fear of losing the love of his life. The restlessness that had filled Michael's nights for weeks began to infiltrate every part of his day, becoming a constant presence that he could no longer ignore. With every gesture, every glance, every word exchanged between him and Catherine, something seemed out of place, as if a shadow hovered between them, invisible but impossible to deny. He kept watching, noticing the little details that had gone unnoticed before, the absences that became more frequent, the hasty apologies, the way she said goodbye with a quick, almost automatic kiss before leaving for art meetings, or encounters with gallery owners. Her distant glances, which he had previously attributed to her concentration on her projects, now seemed to hide something deeper, a secret kept under lock and key. Michael tried to ignore these thoughts, trying to convince himself that they were the result of his own insecurity, but the more he tried to push them away, the more they insisted on growing, on taking shape. On one of those nights when Catherine went out with the excuse of a business dinner, Michael decided not to be content with the silence in the house and the growing emptiness in his chest. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of an old mutual friend, someone Catherine said she had plans to meet. The conversation that followed was brief and revealing, bringing a silent confirmation to the suspicions he had been trying to stifle. Catherine was not where she had said she would be. The tension that was already unbearable now became a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders and robbing him of sleep. In the days that followed, Michael began to watch Catherine more closely, capturing every movement, every word, in search of clues that would reveal the truth. He was determined to find out what was behind her behavior and, even though he didn't want to admit it, he already knew where it would lead. One Tuesday afternoon, while reviewing a report in his office, he received a call he hadn't expected. On the other end of the line, a tense, direct voice introduced itself as an acquaintance of Catherine's, someone who could no longer keep what she knew to herself. The words that followed were short, each one like a dry blow, knocking the air out of him. He was given the address of a cafe where Catherine used to meet another man. When the call ended, Michael remained silent, staring into the void. The pain he felt was overwhelming, but the need for answers was even stronger. That same afternoon, without giving anyone any explanation, he left the office and drove to the indicated location, his heart beating at a disordered pace, his thoughts wandering between anger and disbelief. When he reached the cafe, he parked across the street and looked around, trying to identify Catherine. The place was small, discreet, one of those places she would never choose for a chance encounter, which only increased his suspicion. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and he thought about giving up, when he saw her. Catherine entered the cafe accompanied by a man. They sat at a secluded table, almost hidden in a dimly lit corner. Michael couldn't hear what they were saying, but from where he was, he could see the expression on her face, the easy smile, the soft gestures, the low laughs they exchanged as accomplices in something he couldn't even imagine. That scene broke his heart into pieces. Every laugh, every look was like a blow, wounding a part of him that he thought was impenetrable. Any remaining doubts were dispelled right there, in that moment when he saw with his own eyes what he feared. He remained still, not knowing how to react, until he saw them get up from the table. Catherine and the man left the cafe together, walking side by side, their steps in sync. She looked different, almost a rejuvenated version of herself, someone he barely recognized. Michael, in an impulse that mixed pain and fury, followed the couple at a distance, watching as they made their way to a sophisticated-looking restaurant. He felt his chest tighten, his stomach churn, but his determination to confront them drove him forward. When he entered the restaurant, he went straight to the table where Catherine and the man were sitting, engaged in a conversation so deep that they were slow to notice him. When they finally looked up, Catherine's expression fell into a mixture of surprise and fear. The silence that followed was dense, each second seeming to stretch on for an eternity. Michael felt that everyone around him could hear his heart beating, that anyone who looked at him at that moment would see the pain that consumed him inside. The betrayal didn't need to be said. It was there, in Catherine's frightened eyes, in the expression of contained panic on the face of the man who was with her. Michael took a deep breath, holding back the words running through his mind, the urge to shout, to question them, to demand answers for every minute of silence he had suffered. "So this is where you spend your work nights?" he asked, his voice so calm that it surprised him. Catherine couldn't answer. The guilt on her face was clear, like a wordless confession. The man next to her started to open his mouth, perhaps to justify himself, but Michael interrupted him with an icy stare that made him shut up. There was nothing more to be said. There, on that table, were all the signs he had ignored, all the clues that now came together to form the painful image of the truth. He removed the wedding ring from his finger and, without saying anything, placed it on the table, the cold metal resounding like a final goodbye. Michael looked at Catherine and her lover, both paralyzed in front of him. The silence was dense, and he could almost hear the uncontrolled beats of his own thoughts. Every second that passed deepened the intensity of the scene and, even as he tried to control himself, the pain and anger consumed him. He wasn't the kind of man to explode, scream or make a scene in public, but now, in the face of their betrayal and deafening silence, the self-control that had always defined him seemed about to break. Catherine finally broke the silence, her voice shaky and almost inaudible. "Michael, it's not what it seems," she began, but the words came out fragile, without conviction, as if even she knew that any excuse would be useless. Michael let out a bitter, almost incredulous laugh. "Isn't that what it sounds like?" he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "Then please explain to me what's going on, because from my point of view, everything seems very clear." His eyes turned to her lover, who looked away, clearly uncomfortable and embarrassed. The man next to Catherine, visibly disconcerted, tried to speak. I'm sorry, man. I'm really sorry," he said, his voice low and full of obvious nervousness. I didn't want things to come to this." "You didn't want it to come to this?" Michael's voice carried a coldness that he barely recognized in himself. "And what point did you expect it to reach? How far, exactly, did you think you could go without me noticing?" Silence fell again, and Catherine looked away, avoiding facing him. Michael took a deep breath, trying to contain the anger that threatened to overwhelm him. Then he looked directly at her lover, a calculated coldness in his expression. "You know, I might even have agreed to hear what you have to say, but unfortunately, I already know a lot about you. More than I'd like to know." Catherine's lover frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Michael crossed his arms, leaning forward slightly, the intensity of his gaze fixed on the man in front of him. "I know who you really are, and I know you didn't tell her everything, did you?" Catherine looked at Michael and then at her lover, her face pale and her expression frightened. "What does he mean? What does he know?" Her lover looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if he were carrying a weight that was finally impossible to bear. "Catherine, there are things about my past that I haven't told you. But I thought it didn't matter, that it was in the past and that I could move on." "What things?" Catherine asked, her voice now pitched between fear and disbelief. "What are you hiding from me?" Michael kept silent, letting the weight of the revelation fall on them, watching as the tension between them grew. "He hasn't told you, Catherine, that he's up to his neck in debt, that he has a series of financial problems. And that you, in fact, are just another temporary solution for him." "No, that's not true," the lover retorted, raising his voice, but his insecurity was evident. He avoided facing Michael directly, while Catherine looked at him, now completely frightened. This has nothing to do with her. It doesn't? Michael said, his voice full of irony. Because, as far as I know, you've used this same story before. Catherine, did you know that he's done this other times? That he approached other women for money and support, leaving them when he didn't need them anymore? Catherine's face lost color, and she looked at her lover with horror. Is that true? She whispered, the shock evident in her expression. She searched for some answer, something that could undo that devastating revelation. Is that what you really are? Her lover hesitated, searching for words that would redeem him, but his expression gave away the guilt he was trying to hide. Catherine, I thought it was all buried. I wanted a new life, I wanted you. I thought you were different. Michael shook his head, his gaze implacable. I thought you were different, Catherine. I thought you were someone I could trust, someone I knew. But I see we were both wrong. Michael remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed, cold and intense, moving from Catherine to her lover, as if absorbing every last detail of their expressions. The impact of the revelation still hung over the table, like a dense shadow that made the atmosphere almost unbearable. Catherine seemed oblivious to her surroundings, her world was falling apart right there, at that restaurant table, and she was trying to process everything Michael had said. She looked away, ashamed, unable to face her husband, or even the man next to her. The feeling of betrayal, which now fell upon her in a double way, was overwhelming. In an instant, she realized that not only had she destroyed the marriage she thought was wearing thin, but that she had also been deceived, manipulated, and used by the man she had trusted for the last few months. Michael watched her every reaction, with a mixture of pain and a coldness he didn't know he possessed. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt a kind of dark satisfaction at seeing Catherine in that position, finally confronting the consequences of her choices. For years, he had been the devoted husband, the companion who sacrificed himself to ensure her well-being, to build a secure future. And there she was, shattered by the truth, just as he had been moments before. Her lover, now with trembling hands and a livid face, started to move, trying to find a way out, but he seemed stuck to the ground. He knew that any words he said at that moment would only aggravate the situation, and any attempt at an explanation would sound empty, meaningless. His facade of confidence was completely shattered, and he was nothing more than an ordinary man, humiliated and unmasked. At a loss for words, he just looked at Michael and mumbled something like a hasty apology. I'm sorry. I really didn't mean to. Michael interrupted him with an abrupt gesture, his voice firm and laden with a sharp contempt. It's not a question of intention. You both chose that. You chose to be that kind of man, and Catherine chose to betray everything we've built. Neither of you can hide behind excuses. Catherine finally looked up, her eyes watery with tears and her voice weak. Michael, please, let me explain. Explain, he repeated, with bitter irony. Do you think an explanation will change anything? Do you think any justification will erase what I saw, what you did? He took a deep breath, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions. I always thought we were honest with each other. Even when we disagreed, when things got difficult. But you chose to deceive me, you chose to turn your back on everything. The guilt reflected on Catherine's face was undeniable. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words seemed to slip from her lips. She knew that anything she said would sound empty, and the truth was that even she didn't fully understand how she had allowed things to get to that point. The shame was almost unbearable, and the weight of her own betrayal seemed greater by the second. Michael, I don't know what to say, she whispered, almost inaudibly. Maybe because there's nothing to say. He looked at her with bitter sadness. The truth is that, regardless of any explanation, you've destroyed something that we may never be able to rebuild. Her lover, still sitting at the table, seemed to want to disappear. He looked around, as if trying to find an escape route, but the tension and weight of Michael's words held him in place, motionless. "Look, I think I'd better go," he muttered, without looking directly at Catherine or Michael. "Oh, now you want to go?" Michael said, the irony in his voice making clear the contempt he felt. "Go on, then. Show Catherine what kind of man you really are." Catherine tried to hold her lover's hand, as if that gesture could somehow reaffirm something she no longer knew existed, but he quickly pulled his hand away, embarrassed. He got up without saying another word and, in hurried, trembling steps, left the restaurant, like a defeated man. Catherine stood there, watching him go, while the weight of the silence between her and Michael became more and more oppressive. When they were alone, Catherine finally managed to gather the strength to speak. "Michael, please, let me explain. I never wanted it to be like this. I never thought I would hurt you like this." He stared at her, his eyes cold but filled with a pain that was impossible to hide. "You never thought you'd hurt me? Catherine, you chose all this. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a momentary mistake. It was months of lies, betrayals and deceit. How did you expect it not to hurt me?" She tried to answer, but her voice failed her, and a tear ran down her cheek. "I lost myself, Michael. I let myself get carried away by an illusion, and now I see how foolish I was. I know it's too late, but I'm sorry." Michael remained silent, watching her as she broke down in tears in front of him. For years, he had imagined their love as something solid, unbreakable. He had always believed that, even in difficult times, they would be together, overcoming everything. But here was the brutal truth: the love he had devoted to Catherine had been discarded for a moment of weakness, of illusion, and he didn't know if he could forgive her. "I'm sorry," he muttered, almost to himself. "Catherine, sorry doesn't change anything. It doesn't erase anything." She nodded, silently, as if she recognized that there was nothing more she could do or say to remedy what had happened. The weight of the betrayal between them was overwhelming, and they both knew that things would never be the same again. The silence between them was interrupted only by the movement of the restaurant around them, as if the world was still spinning while theirs was falling apart. Michael looked at his watch, a gesture that seemed insignificant, but which, for Catherine, was like a last sign that he was about to leave her life forever. She tried one last appeal. "Michael, I know you'll probably never forgive me. But I love you. I loved every moment we had together. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I never stopped loving you." He watched her in silence, feeling the weight of her words and, at the same time, the insurmountable distance that had been created between them. "Love," he finally said, his voice laden with a deep bitterness. "True love does not destroy. True love doesn't lie, it doesn't deceive." She lowered her head, unable to face him, as he stood up, straightening his coat and picking up his things with frightening calm. "I don't know what will become of us now, Catherine. But the way I am now, I don't see how I can go on." He walked away slowly, each step echoing in the silence, while Catherine sat alone, surrounded by the emptiness she herself had created. Michael's words still echoed in her mind, and she knew with painful certainty that the destruction she had caused would not be easy to repair. With one last look, he left the restaurant without looking back. Life moved on at a heavy pace after that night. Michael, who until then had his life organized and his path planned out, found himself in an immense void. Mornings that used to be filled with simple gestures at Catherine's side were now lonely, weighed down by an absence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. He had temporarily moved to a small apartment, far from the life he had shared with her, far from the places that brought back painful memories. The silence of each new day was a reminder that the love he thought was unbreakable had been irreparably shattered. Even in the midst of the pain and mourning over the end of the relationship, Michael dedicated himself to rebuilding his own life, focusing on his work. He knew that there was no other way to move forward than to get back into a routine, and so he did. However, what had once been a source of pride and fulfillment for him now seemed purposeless. His professional achievements no longer had the luster of before, and the motivation he had always had to grow in his career had been consumed by the bitterness of that betrayal. While Michael tried to find a new direction, Catherine remained in a state of confusion and regret. The life she knew had been destroyed by her own hands, and the weight of that responsibility haunted her day and night. The memories of the love they had had were now like sharp knives, cutting her with the memory of what she had lost. The house, which had once been a space full of life and laughter, was now immersed in silence and loneliness. She tried to occupy herself by working in the art studio, looking for a distraction, a way to escape the guilt that was eating away at her. But every brushstroke on the canvas seemed meaningless, as if the creativity that drove her had disappeared along with the marriage. She could barely look at her own reflection in the mirror, remembering the trust Michael had placed in her, the security he offered that she had discarded. Meanwhile, Catherine's lover was facing his own consequences. The weight of the debts he had tried to avoid came to the surface and, without the financial support he had come to expect from Catherine, he found himself in a desperate situation. His schemes of manipulation and lies no longer offered him an easy way out, and he ended up losing his job due to the scandal that eventually spread to his social and professional circle. The life he had tried to build by exploiting other people was crumbling around him, revealing the emptiness of his own actions. A few months later, Catherine and Michael had to meet again, this time to finalize the divorce proceedings. The room was cold, impersonal, and the atmosphere between them was dense, full of unspoken feelings. Michael was different, his eyes seemed colder, more cautious, as if he had built an insurmountable barrier around himself so that he would never allow anyone to hurt him like that again. Catherine tried to start a conversation, perhaps seeking some kind of understanding, but the words seemed to escape her, and the silence between them continued, laden with an irremediable sadness. "Michael," she finally murmured, breaking the silence. "I just wanted you to know that. I regret everything. If I could go back and change what I did, I would do it without hesitation." He looked at her, but his face showed no emotion. There was something unchanging in that expression, as if the man she knew was no longer there. "Regret doesn't erase what you did, Catherine," he replied, his voice firm but without rancor. "I lived a nightmare because of you. And the truth is that you took something from me that I'll never get back." Catherine felt the impact of those words and lowered her head. She knew that regret was all she had, but at that moment she understood that it meant nothing to him. His love for her had been destroyed, and she would forever be a bitter memory in his life. When the lawyer announced that the proceedings were officially over, she knew that this was the definitive end of everything they had been. After the divorce, Michael moved on with his life. He chose to seek therapeutic help, trying to understand and heal the deep emotional wounds that the betrayal had left. Over time, he began to see things more clearly, realizing that Catherine's betrayal, as devastating as it had been, should not define his future. Gradually, he rebuilt his trust, found new friendships and was eventually able to open his heart again, albeit cautiously. The experience had made him stronger, more resilient and, above all, more aware of himself and the values that really mattered to him. Catherine, on the other hand, never fully overcame the weight of the choices she had made. She tried to move on, but every attempt to rebuild her life was permeated by memories of what she had lost. Her art became dark, a reflection of the feelings of regret and loss that haunted her. Loneliness was her new companion, and the pain of having destroyed something so precious followed her wherever she went. She began to avoid the places she used to go with Michael, unable to bear the memory of a life she herself had destroyed. In her search for redemption, she began working on an art project that dealt with themes of guilt, loss, and reconstruction, trying to transform her pain into something that could somehow bring meaning. Her lover also came to a bitter end. Out of work, in debt and discredited, he realized that there was no one else he could lean on. The women he had manipulated in the past now rejected him, and he found himself alone, facing the weight of his own choices. His life, once filled with superficiality and lies, fell apart, and he was forced to confront the reality he had avoided for so long. The cruel irony was that, in trying to exploit others, he had ended up destroying himself, becoming a hostage to his own greed and lack of character. Years later, Michael found someone who truly loved him and respected the values he cherished. He built a new life, away from the shadows of the past, and finally knew what it was to love and be loved genuinely and without reservation. Catherine, on the other hand, remained scarred by the betrayal she had committed, knowing that regret would be the burden she would carry forever. And so the cycle of pain and redemption ran its course, with each character paying the price for their choices, and Michael finally finding the peace he deserved. So, what did you think of the story? Let us know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this one. Remember that we don't support any kind of betrayal here, our aim is to show how choices and actions have profound consequences. Thanks for following and see you next time.